The liberals got the mineral rights. And by mineral rights, I mean everything.
There's a moment I find humanizing of perhaps the most morally reprehensible person in Disco Elysium. It's so caked in real-world history, primarily through analog and drawing on deep philosophical roots. You've been circling around her for hours of gameplay. Senior agent for the Wild Pines Group, the massive shipping conglomerate whose cargo container started the whole mess that your investigation is trying to untangle. She's been patient with you in the way that powerful people are patient with anyone who cannot actually harm them. Which is to say, professionally, warmly, and with zero intention of giving you anything she doesn't choose to give you. She is guarded so well that most players, upon ending their first conversation, will be told by Kim that she was running circles around you, holding total control of the conversation's course, despite the pleasant neutrality of her tone. And then you push a bit further. You ask the right questions, or perhaps the wrong ones, depending on your perspective, and she tells you this.
I am the vilest of the vile. A traitor, a devourer of nations and infants. I am an ultra.
She doesn't say this defensively. She doesn't say it with a confession retched out of her. There is, from the game's narration that tells us, a sudden flash of teeth. It reads like relief. Like someone finally getting to put down a weight that they've been carrying so long they've stopped noticing it. Harry can read in her eyes as conversation goes on that there's a mix of sincerity and self-satire in her presentation, as though presenting the more blunt characterization of herself, semi-ironically, may maintain some shield of deniability on her conscience. And then, just as significantly...
Yes. I am the nether creature of the Forbidden Swamp. I pushed the king under a shit wagon and betrayed the revolution. My kind surrendered the nation to financial colonists. I can see you thought we'd gone extinct. After all, no sane person identifies as an ultra-liberal anymore.
This video is what she means by that. Why she's right, and why that matters to all of us living. That she's right. It's also about why the word she uses, ultra-liberal, is a better, more honest word than the one that we have been using. And even just cut off the liberal, just call them ultras as short. What happens to a world, real or fictional, when the people running it refuse to acknowledge what they actually are, and how that has ramifications across all? I want to say something briefly about Disco Elysium for anyone who stumbled onto this video without having played it, or for those who played it a while ago and might need the world refreshed. Disco Elysium is a game developed by Zaum, a studio founded by Estonian writer Robert Kurvits and artist Alexander Rostov. After its release, the company was snatched up from its creators. It is set on the fictional world of Elysium, on a peninsula called Revachol, a once grand city that has now been in a state of managed, administered ruin for over 40 years following a failed communist revolution. In it, you are investigating a murder in the city's most devastated district, Martinez. The Revachol Citizens Militia, or RCM, is the only element of organized, official law enforcement, as decades of decay and managed decline has kept the people of Martinez from regaining self-determination over their own ways of life. The game is, among other things, a political education, not in a hectoring or didactic way. It doesn't tell you what to think. In fact, it's the funniest game I've ever played. But it takes the ideology seriously as something that shapes how people actually see and live in the world, and picks at and exposes to light the historical flaws and character pitfalls of the ideology's recurring tenets. Every major post-feudal political tradition, communism, fascism, liberalism, what the game calls moralism, is given its fullest, most internally coherent expression, usually through a character who genuinely believes it and can at least try to explain why. The game respects its ideologies enough to at least let them make their own arguments before it shows you their consequences. Not that it's exhaustive, obviously, there are many different ways to hold many different types of ideologies, but it's a very good encapsulation of trends. Messier is the game's ultra-liberal, and she is one of the most effective political portraits in the history of fiction. Not because she's villainous in any obvious way, but because she is, by almost any ordinary measure, the most sympathetic and competent person in the entire game. She's helpful, she's honest, she's funny, she is charming in the way that the game's empathy skill keeps noticing. The psychic voice that reads the emotional subtext keeps catching a mixture of truth and self-satire. Decades of guilt and pride. That mixture is the point. That human mixture is what this essay is about. Before we can talk about ultras or ultraliberals, we need to talk about liberals. Actually talk about them. The original thing. The idea that generated the word before the word got hollowed out and repurposed and turned into a costume that something quite different started wearing. Because the word liberal did mean something, even in its contradictions. It meant something real and historically important. In its time, genuinely radical. If you call yourself a liberal in 1776, you were signing your death warrant. The intellectual architecture of classical liberalism was built over roughly a century, from the mid-1600s through the late 1700s, and by people who were primarily concerned with one question. What are the limits of legitimate power? What can government, a church, a king, actually rightfully do to you? Enlightenment thinkers like Kant aimed to root morals entirely separate from any specific god or gods, even as he believed in one, because he believed the nature of reality itself called for a particular moral framework. John Locke, often called the father of liberalism, argued in 1689 that human beings have natural rights that precede and supersede any government or social institution. Life, liberty, property. These aren't granted by the crown. They're not given to you by God through a priest. They exist because you are a person, that you have life, that you have experience, and any government that violates them has forfeited its legitimacy. The property element may sound strange today, but given centuries of aristocrats and king-favored gentry being given land by means of birth and pure circumstance alone, and of most people being subject to lords and unable to even tend to a field that they could call their own, made property something which no person has more inherent right to than another, an illustrative example. That sounds obvious now. In 1689, it was explosive. It became one of the philosophical foundations of the Glorious Revolution, and 100 years later would become the French Revolution and travel across the Atlantic to become the intellectual framework for the American Revolution. Thomas Paine took that framework and made it popular. Common Sense, published in January of '76, was not addressed to elites or philosophers. It was addressed to the common people of the American colonies in language they could understand. Paine was not a man of property. He was a corset maker turned political firebrand who wrote to be read aloud in taverns. He wanted ordinary people to understand that the arrangement that they had been born into was not natural, not God-given, not even God-ordained, and definitely not inevitable. His case against hereditary rule is worth quoting directly, because the plainness of the language is the point when faced with centuries of divine right of kings framework, plastered on top of what would be a true faith. For all men, being originally equals, no one by birth could have the right to set up his own family in perpetual preference to all others forever. That's it. The whole argument. The son of a good king does not inherit the right to govern. The premise of hereditary rule is incoherent on its face. The only reason it persists is because the people with power say it does, and they have the means to hold power. And so they do. But Paine went further than that. He wasn't just opposed to monarchy as a form, he understood where concentrated power came from in the first place. He wrote that if we could strip back the mythology around the first kings, we would find them to be nothing more than the principal ruffian of some restless gang, whose savage manners of preeminence in subtlety obtained him the title of chief among plunderers, and who, by increasing in power and extending his depredations, overawed the quiet and defenseless to purchase their safety by frequent contributions. The first king was a gangster. The state began as organized extortion, mob rule. Power originates not in divine right or natural order, but in violence and credible threat of more violence. The frequent contributions paid to the principal ruffian for protection from other ruffians. This is the origin story of taxation, of sovereignty, of everything we call legitimate government. Paine understood this, and so he wrote it for a popular audience because he believed that they could handle this truth. He also understood that the purpose of government stripped of mythology was simple. Society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. In its worst state is an intolerable one, for when we suffer or are exposed to the same miseries by a government, which we might expect in a country without a government, our calamities are heightened by reflecting that we furnish the means by which we suffer. We furnish the means by which we suffer. When a government imposes on its people the same miseries that it was created to prevent. When the protection racket stops pretending to be protection. The people are paying for their own oppression. Hold that phrase. We'll need it later. It's the reason why the only valid means of just governance is by the people. Without the consent of the governed, how can we assert ourselves justifiably? John Stuart Mill came after Paine. His work On Liberty was published in 1859 and added something that the earlier tradition had not fully articulated. Mill was concerned not just with government tyranny, but the tyranny of society itself. He wrote, "Society can and does execute its own mandates, and if it issues wrong mandates instead of right, or any mandates at all in things by which it ought not meddle, it practices a social tyranny more formidable than any kinds of political oppression, since, though not usually upheld by the extreme penalties, it leaves fewer means of escape, penetrating much more deeply in the details of life and enslaving the soul itself. Social tyranny, the pressure to conform, the weight of prevailing opinion, the slow suffocation of any thought that deviates from what everyone around you already believes." Mill considered this more dangerous than government oppression itself because it leaves fewer means of escape. It enslaves the soul itself to a constant pessimistic learned helplessness. Him writing this while most democracies practiced caste slavery just a few years before the American Civil War, and serfdom prevailed across the nations that didn't do slavery directly, it shouldn't be lost on us. This is liberalism at its most genuinely radical, and it is a long way from what liberalism came to mean in practice, what liberalism became represented as in its modern neoliberal tradition. I'd like to dwell here for a moment, because this essay is going to spend a considerable amount of time being critical of what the liberal tradition became. And I don't want to obscure what it actually achieved. The freedom of conscience that Mill defended, the right to think the wrong thoughts, publish the wrong arguments, hold the wrong religion or no religion at all, is a cornerstone of any world that's worth living in. The anti-monarchical, anti-hereditary privilege argument that Paine made at enormous personal risk is a genuine moral achievement. The liberal tradition at its best was about limiting concentrated power over individual peoples, of freeing the soul from its animal flesh, of the actualization of the self. It genuinely was. But, and this is crucial, because Mill, the same thinker who wrote that passage about social tyranny enslaving the soul, also wrote this in the same work. Wherever there is an ascendant class, a large portion of the morality of the country emanates from its class interests and its feelings of class superiority. He states this as a descriptive fact, not as a critique of any particular class. The morality of an ascendant class is a rationalization of its position. The feeling of class superiority generates the moral framework that justifies those feelings. Mill identified the mechanism precisely, the way that ideas of the ruling class become the ruling ideas, and then, for the most part, continue to operate within the framework those ideas had themselves constructed. This is an internal tension that runs through the entirety of the liberal tradition from its beginning. Classical liberalism was always in conflict with itself because it operated with two different definitions of freedom that it equivocated between. Freedom from the king telling you what to believe, and freedom from the government telling you what to do with your property. These sound similar. They are not the same. The first is freedom of persons. The second is freedom of capital. And in the 19th century, as industrial capitalism developed in the world and the property-owning class became dominant over the group of persons as a whole, it became clear that these two freedoms often pulled in opposite directions of each other, and at different speeds depending on the extent of class divides. The freedom of the cotton mill owner to run his factory as he pleased meant the freedom to work children 12 hours a day in dangerous conditions. The freedom to run a business how the owner liked meant the freedom to poison people with contaminated food, as Uptown Sinclair's The Jungle criticized from the meatpacking and preparation industry over 100 years ago. The freedom of the East India Company to conduct trade as it saw fit meant the freedom to monopolize food supplies and let millions of Indians starve to death, despite producing the food that they weren't themselves allowed to eat. The liberal who believed in freedom of conscience and the liberal who believed in freedom of contract were, by the 19th century, different people with increasingly opposed material interests. Mill himself is a perfect illustration of this tension. He wrote on liberty. He also wrote that despotism is a legitimate mode of government for backward states of society. But we'll come back to that passage later, because it is the most important and perhaps foresightful thing that Mill wrote for understanding what this essay is actually about. The point for now is this. The liberal tradition produced the abolition of divine right, freedom of the press, the end of hereditary aristocracy as a legal category, religious toleration, and intellectual framework for self-democratic governance. It also produced the modern ideological scaffolding for empire, for the enclosure of common lands, for the destruction of labor organizing, and for the proposition that free market outcomes are equivalent to freedom itself. The history of liberalism, from the 19th century to now, is largely a story of which of those things won by suffocating the other.
Liberals are usually middle-class people, Detective, or the remaining gentry, the beneficiaries of the pre-revolutionary arrangement.
Joyce is not being reductive here. She's being precise. In Revachol's history, as in our own, liberals came to mean the people who had something to protect, the arrangements that they were beneficiaries of, the mineral rights, Mill's ascendant class and its morality that emanates from class interests, not from the philosophy of Paine or the harm principle of on liberty, but from the accumulated interests of the people who owned things and intended to keep owning them. Birth of the ultra, when market freedom became the only freedom. So how does tradition of Paine and Mill become Joyce Messier? How do you get from all men being originally equals and no one by birth could have a right to a shipping company representatively administering the permanent economic prostration of a city while explaining quite cheerfully that this is just how things work? A company which itself gained its initial foothold in the pre-revolutionary feudal arrangement. The answer involves a specific moment in intellectual history that doesn't get talked about nearly often enough, partly because it's quite boring. It happened mostly at academic conferences and in dry economic papers, and partly because people responsible for it were very careful to dress it up in the old vocabulary of freedom. In 1944, an Austrian economist named Friedrich Hayek published The Road to Serfdom. It was an argument against centrally planned economics, specifically against the British left's post-war plans for nationalization and the welfare state. Hayek's argument was not that people should be free to think and believe as they pleased. Hayek's argument was that economic freedom, the freedom of markets from government interference, was the foundation of all other freedoms, and that any governmental intervention into the economy, no matter how well-intentioned, inevitably led toward totalitarianism. This was an overstatement. Sweden did not become a totalitarian state because it built a welfare system. The most socialized European countries are by most scales the happiest and most economically regulated, from Sweden to Denmark to Norway. But the road to serfdom was not primarily a work of careful empirical analysis, it was a political intervention. It was serialized in Reader's Digest, and it became the American business class's intellectual framework for opposing everything from the ascendance of Roosevelt's New Deal to labor unions to public health care. Hayek gathered around him a network of like-minded thinkers. In 1947, they met Mont Pelerin in Switzerland and founded the Mont Pelerin Society. The members include Milton Friedman, who would become the movement's most influential public voice, and crucially, businessmen who were delighted to fund an intellectual project arguing that their economic interests were synonymous with human freedom itself. Here is where Mill's dead dogma applies. The liberal tradition had always contained the genuine commitment to freedom of persons that Paine articulated and Mill refined. But by the 1940s and 50s, the commitment had become, in Mill's precise phrase, a dead dogma, not a living truth. The shell and husk of that meaning were retained. The word freedom, the vocabulary of rights and liberty, the inheritance of the Enlightenment, the finer essence, though. Freedom of conscience, freedom from concentrated power, the harm principle itself, applied to other persons rather than to just property, had been lost. What remained was the vocabulary of freedom, now deployed in service of a program that Paine would have recognized immediately as the principal ruffian's protection racket wearing a new suit. The Mont Pelerin Project resolved the liberal tradition's internal tension definitively, permanently, and in one decisive, murderous direction. Henceforth, market freedom was not one kind of freedom among others, it was the source and foundation of all freedoms. Protect the market and everything else follows. Interfere with the market in the name of any other value, equality, social welfare, democratic decision-making about economic life, and you are building the road to serfdom. Milton Friedman was an evangelist of this project. His 1962 book, Capitalism and Freedom, made the case in accessible prose. Free markets and political freedoms are inseparable. Government intervention is the enemy of both. Public education, minimum wages, social security, all are encroachments on freedom that should be dismantled. In 1976, Friedman won the Nobel Prize in Economics. His ideas moved from the margins of academic debate into the center of policy discourse. And how could they not, when the people who owned the means for transporting those ideas were fundamentally the ones who benefited from those beliefs spreading? And then, in the 1970s and early 1980s, the Mont Pelerin Project founded its delivery mechanism. But before we get to Thatcher and Reagan, before we get to Joyce, I need to talk about what happened in Chile in 1973, because Chile is where the Friedmanite project was first implemented at full scale, and because Chile is where this essay's most important argument begins to take shape. On September 11th, 1973, a military coup led by General Augusto Pinochet overthrew the democratically elected socialist government of Salvador Allende. Allende had been elected in 1970 on a platform of nationalizing Chile's copper mines, owned primarily by American corporations, and implementing democratic socialism. He was not a Soviet-allied communist. He was trying to use the mechanisms of democracy to give Chile's resources back to the Chileans. Similar incidents happened all throughout the world in countries which historically were subject to Western business interests. A similar case in Iran happened in the 50s, when Iran elected Mossadegh, a lawyer who intended to nationalize the oil industry from the control of the United States and United Kingdom. He was murdered and replaced with the dictatorial Shah, who was subservient to Western interests. Anti-democratic coups d'etats became more and more frequent as Western business interests took the aggressive market freedom of the owning class over the human right to life of Thomas Paine's liberalism. The nationalization of Chile, as elsewhere, was intolerable in two groups of people. The first was the Nixon administration and the CIA, who had spent 3 years attempting to prevent Allende from taking power, and then when they failed, when the Chilean people didn't buy the snake oil, but instead committed to democracy and made their own self-determination, they ran a covert campaign to make the economy scream, deliberately destabilizing Chile's economy, brutally beating in its shins economically to try and discredit Allende's government. The second group was Chile's own business class and landed elite, who stood to lose enormously from the nationalization. Even if the country on the whole was subject to foreign interests, those interests still needed people to carry out and transfer their resources. Chile's business elite, then, betrayed their own citizenry to maintain their grip on resources for exchange of the mineral rights, like a lord paying taxes to a king, while the peasants remained poor and without true democratic freedom or any voice, just the illusion of such. Liberalism, which had thrown off the shackles of monarchy, had eventually reinforced monarchy with additional steps. The violent coup succeeded. Allende died in the presidential palace during the siege. Pinochet's fascist regime immediately began to torture, execute, and disappear thousands of supporters of the Allende government, from union organizers, students, journalists, intellectuals, even priests shot in front of their churches. Anyone considered an obstacle to the new order were killed. The most commonly and horrifically referred back to as an image are the events of throwing political dissidents out of helicopters. This is not disputed history. There are plenty of bodies. There are survivor testimonies. There are the CIA's own reporting. There are mass graves filled with bodies who merely aimed to the ideals of liberalism that freed liberalism from monarchy. And then a group of Chilean economists who had been trained at the University of Chicago under Milton Friedman, they were called without irony the Chicago Boys, were given control of the Chilean economy. Under Pinochet's military dictatorship, Friedman's program was implemented in its purest form. State enterprises were privatized, import tariffs were slashed, capital controls were removed, labor protections were destroyed. You cannot have strong unions when union organizers are being routinely executed. When the gentry have all the power, they can merely wield it with force and ignore democracy. The welfare state was dismantled, Social Security was privatized, public education was marketed. After all, without basic education, it is much easier to use persons as something like cattle on a field a farmer owns. They won't try to run away when they know that they can't. They won't know how to organize if the information never comes to them. The psychological toll of learned helplessness fundamentally works to make them less human than the owning class. Milton Friedman himself visited Pinochet's Chile in 1975 and gave lectures there. He wrote Pinochet a letter of economic advice, and he later called the Chilean economic program a miracle. When asked about the regime's human rights record, he said that he considered himself responsible only for his own advice on economic policy, not for what the government did otherwise. This is the ultra's purest logic rendered in historical fact. The market is free. What happens to the humans in the market is a separate question, not a consideration, not our department. Freedom means Joyce's company can move its containers through Revachol's harbor. What happens to the quote-unquote people of Martinez is not a freedom question, it's an administration question. The dock workers have their role to play, that is, in passing the resources to other, more important, more human people. The Chicago Boys program did reduce inflation. It also produced a financial crisis in 1982 that wiped out much of Chile's middle class and required massive government bailouts of the very banks that had been privatized. Sounds kind of like 2008, huh? The miracle required a military dictatorship to implement because no democratic population would have ever voted for it. Friedman's student, Arnold Harberger, deeply involved in the Chicago Boys project, acknowledged that the program's implementation required extraordinary political conditions. Extraordinary political conditions meaning a government that could arrest and kill people who objected. Hold that detail. We'll come back to it at length. Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in 1979. She was a true ideological believer in a way that British conservative prime ministers had never really been before. They had been pragmatists, managing their institutions properly, balancing their interests. Thatcher had read Hayek. She had been intellectually formed by the Mont-Pérelin project. She knew what she was doing and why she was doing it, and she was prepared to do it against enormous opposition. The Disco Elysium community has long recognized Joyce Messier as a Thatcher-like figure. The visual design makes it very legible. The practical, weatherproof clothing on a working waterfront, the patrician composure, the unsentimental intelligence, and of course her hair. But it does go deeper than appearance. What Joyce shares with Thatcher is quality of the self-awareness. Thatcher fully understood what her program would do to British communities built around coal mining, steel production, and heavy industry. She implemented it anyway. She called the poor coal miners the enemy within. That also sounds familiar. She broke the National Union of Mine Workers in a strike from 1984 to 1985, not reluctantly but deliberately, because she understood that organized labor was the primary cultural, structural obstacle to the Ultra Project in Britain. And she had chosen a side. The ultraliberal label that Disco Elysium uses, rather than the neoliberal one that you may be more familiar with, is part of the French political nomenclature. We in other parts of the West, or in the United States, call this neoliberalism and neoconservatism. Because socially, they move toward liberal values or conservative values, while economically maintaining, essentially, lockstep. When Thatcher was asked about the social consequence of her economic policies, the communities destroyed, the unemployment, the rise in poverty, she had an answer ready. "There is no such thing as society," she said in a 1987 interview. "There are individual men and women, and there are families." This is not a gaffe. It is a philosophical position. If there is no such thing as society, then the destruction of a community is not harm that can be weighed against anything, because community is not a thing that exists in this framework. There are only individuals and their market choices. The miner who cannot find work anymore is an individual who has made market choices that resulted in their unemployment. The structural devastation of an entire way of life by deliberate government policy is, in this framework, invisible, because the framework has defined it out of existence. The form that morality takes, and is judged by, is weighed by economic choices, something business interests had spent decades propping up with things like the prosperity gospel in the United States, prepping the American citizenry and petty political class to accept subjugation as a means of moral failure. Thatcher would not have said if she was an ultraliberal. She said she was a conservative. But the Conservative Party has always been the party of established institutions. The church, the army, the landed gentry, the slow management of tradition. Thatcher had no interest in institutions. She wanted to transform Britain according to an ideological program. The old Tories hated her for it, and she didn't care. She had the cannons. After Thatcher and Reagan spent a decade dismantling the post-war settlement, the welfare state, regulated capitalism, strong unions, public ownership of key industries, the left-wing parties of the West faced a choice. They could argue that dismantling was wrong, defend the structure that had been destroyed and offer to rebuild them, or they could accept the new architecture as permanent and try to win elections within it. They chose the second option, at dismay of all of our populations. And they called it the Third Way.
I am the vilest of the vile, a traitor, a devourer of nations and infants. I am an ultra. Yes, I am the nether creature of the forbidden swamp. I pushed the king under a shit wagon and betrayed the revolution. My kind surrendered the nation to financial colonists. I can see you thought we'd gone extinct. After all, no sane person identifies as an ultra-liberal anymore. Not in broad daylight.
Before I describe what the Third Way actually was and is, I need to introduce a piece of writing that Disco Elysium's writers also had clearly read. In June of 2014, a blogger and critic named Sam Creese published an essay simply titled, "Tony Blair, Dread Creature of the Forbidden Swamp," on his blog, Idiot Joy Showland. It is one of the most astonishing pieces of political writing I've encountered, and was especially amazing when looking at it compared to the portrayal of Joyce in Disco Elysium. It begins with an Engels epigraph about the history as a process of human evolution, and then proceeds to argue that Tony Blair is a creature older than time itself, a demon who takes different forms in different cultures, an entity that enters communities with charm and promises, performs transformation, and leaves ruin. Kreese traces Blair's genealogy across human civilization. The Sumerians had a version, a snake demon who would enter a walled city disguised as a man and then uncoil his vast, scaly bulk and devour everything inside. Chris argues medieval peasants knew him as Balfar, a fairy creature who feasts you at a great banquet until you realize the food isn't real and you've been eating dirt from the ground. And most relevantly, Blair appears in the Daemonology of King James I as Tiberaxix, a devil who, being of great charm and guile, sneaketh into the homes of the godly, and persuades them to addict themselves to his service. Now look at what Joyce says, quoting the in-universe Franco-Nigerian play that Harry half remembers from somewhere.
Tell me, now that I've uncoiled myself, do you find me frightening?
In her green eyes you see a mixture of truth and self-satire. Decades of guilt and pride.
A devil, who being of great charm and guile, sneaketh into the homes of the godly.
That dialect is obeisant. You recognize it's a quote from somewhere. A play written way back in the Franco-Nigerian century.
Ah, maybe you remember more than you let on, despite whatever brain damage the alcohol may have inflicted. I hope so. I hope we are able to continue as friends despite my scaly bulk, and the insanity, bloodshed, and transfer of wealth that took place here. It was not the plan all along.
The game's writers took the essay, especially from Chris's quotes, and put it into Joyce's mouth as a self-description. They are making an explicit argument. Joyce is Blair. The Ultra is the Blair type, the third-way politician who ended conservative rule by ending the conservative monopoly on evil, in the same archetype as the shipping company representative managing Martinez's permanent ruin. Chris also described Blair as a nether creature who rises every couple of months like a bubble of swamp gas from his ancient swamp. Joyce describes herself as the nether creature of the Forbidden Swamp. The game is not being subtle. It is telling you what Joyce, with clear eyes, can acknowledge herself to be, even if she needs to shroud it in blunt irony for her own conscience's sake. And this is where Mill's Dead Dogma passage does its sharpest work. The third way, intellectually associated with socialist Anthony Giddens, politically implemented by Blair in Britain and Bill Clinton in America, was the proposition that social justice and market economics were not in tension, that the left could embrace global capitalism while pursuing progressive social goals. What it actually was, using Mill's language, was the liberal tradition's emancipatory commitments held as dead dogma, not a living truth. The shell and husk retained itself. Equality, opportunity, progress, freedom, the finer essence and meaning of those words were gone completely. Freedom was just market freedom. Opportunity as opportunity to access the market. Progress as GDP growth. The vocabulary was preserved exactly so that no one would notice the content had been exhumed. Blair won his enormous majority in 1997. The country erupted. Things can only get better, played at the election night celebrations. There was a genuine wave of relief and hope that a generation of Thatcherism was finally over. Similarly to Obama in the US, just 10 years later. The reality of things was that Blair had just learned to smile and wear a better-fitting suit. He managed Thatcher's anti-union legislation, refused to renationalize the privatized utilities. He pursued private finance initiatives, a mechanism for building public infrastructure using private capital, which proved catastrophic for the NHS over the following decades, costing vastly more than a direct public borrowing option would have. He deregulated the City of London. He took Britain into the Iraq War on intelligence that he knew or should have known was entirely unreliable, resulting in hundreds of thousands of deaths and the destabilization of the region which remains even to today. He left office to become enormously wealthy as a consultant to national and foreign governments both, something which has become an entire norm for basically anyone serving in Western governments. Or more accurately, to their transnational corporate overlords, who don't care any bit about any singular state. Bill Clinton is the American Blair, temporally slightly earlier, but structurally identical. The Democratic Leadership Council, which Clinton chaired before his presidential run, was explicitly founded to move the Democratic Party away from labor and toward business. Clinton governed accordingly. NAFTA was passed over the strenuous opposition of American labor unions, who correctly predicted that it would offshore manufacturing jobs. The repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, a Depression-era law separating commercial and investment banking, removed the firewall that had speculative investment banking away from depositors' money. The shields that had been put in place to guard the economy from the sort of 1920s stock market crash disaster. The 1994 crime bill expanded the criminal system dramatically, with effects that fell overwhelmingly on black communities. Welfare reform replaced guaranteed income support with time-limited workfare. Privately run prisons became an easy way to make money, since you could just, arrest people, force the incarcerated to continue doing work, and not pay them a minimum wage.
When the dust settled, the Liberals were the only ones left to clean up the mess. By virtue of their survival, they were handed enormous power to shape the future. This was all our last generation managed.
This is what they managed. The third way ultras, Blair, Clinton, and the political reformation that they represented, took power after the first wave of Thatcher-Reagan implementation and reversed the course not one bit. They administered it more humanely, perhaps, more sensibly, in the sense that the Joycean administration of Martinez is more humane than shooting everyone in the head. They added cultural progressivism, racial inclusion, LGBTQ+ rights, and in return, kept the mineral rights for themselves. Democracy became the field of social legislation of the nation, with no one daring touch the god of the market. They ended conservative and Republican monopolies on power while maintaining the economic architecture that those monopolies had built. An increasingly complex machine, guarding the same land and gentry of the old kings and aristocracy, with a t-shirt cannon given to the public to occasionally allow a person out of their cage. The existence of which to reinforce the failures of individual actors for not escaping themselves. Any time too many began to escape from their birth class, the economic force adjusted to cut the openings off and change the secret new entrances. Like a perpetual hedge maze, adjusting its path to freedom continuously as the individual traverses through it. The liberal tradition's vocabulary was kept alive precisely to paper over what had been lost. A dead dogma, the shell and a husk. The finer essence, the soul of the ideology, dead and gone. Scratch and ultra, the structural relationship to fascism. Here is a claim I want to make carefully, because it is the type of claim that gets shouted across political divides without much analysis, and the analysis is what makes it useful to know. The claim? The business class, the property-owning, capital-holding class that the ultra ideology represents, does not have a principled opposition to fascism. It has a conditional, tactical opposition to fascism when fascism threatens its interests, and a historical tendency to fund, enable, and accommodate fascism when fascism is directed at the organized left. This is not a conspiracy theory. There is no secret meeting or cabal. There's no handshake between the boardroom and the torch march. It is a structural tendency that follows from the ultras' actual priorities, and it is played out with remarkable consistency across the 20th century, dozens of times, though most crucially in the Second World War.
Perhaps it wouldn't have turned out that way had I been in charge. I might have bet on the king and led the Pines to doom. I would have sided with the cannons.
I want to introduce a witness before I go through history. His name was Smedley Butler, and he is one of the most remarkable national heroic figures in American military history, not nearly as recognized as he should be for saving democracy. Not for his career, which was long and distinguished, covered in medals, working on all sorts of different military tours, but for what he said about it afterward and what he did to protect the idea of the American founding, of American freedom, that he always took himself to be defending when he first enlisted. Butler was a major general in the Marines, twice awarded the Medal of Honor, the most decorated Marine in American history at the time of his death. In 1935, after retiring, he wrote a pamphlet called War is a Racket. It opens with this: "War is a racket. It always has been. It is possibly the oldest, easily the most profitable, surely the most vicious. It is the only one international in scope. It is the only one which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives." And then, a racket is best described, I believe, as something that is not what it seems to the majority of people. Only a small inside group knows what it is about. It is conducted for the benefit of the very few, and at the life expense of the very many. Butler's pamphlet documents in specific, numbered detail the war profits extracted during World War I, DuPont's earnings increasing by 950%, Bethlehem Steel's profits jumping from $6 million to $49 million per year, International Nickel's profits increasing over 1,700%. He notes that the soldiers who fought the war were paid $30 a month, half of which was immediately deducted to support their dependents, while the manufacturers made hundreds of % profit on mosquito nets that never even reached France or participated in the war, on airplanes that never left the ground, on equipment that sat in warehouses after the armistice. He describes the propaganda used to send those soldiers to die, things that are recaptured in famous cultural memory in movies like All's Quiet on the Western Front. He describes the propaganda used to send those soldiers to die. "Beautiful ideals were painted for our boys who were sent out to die. This was the war to end wars. This was the war to make the world safe for democracy. No one told them that dollars and cents were the real reason. No one mentioned to them as they marched away that their going and their dying would mean huge war profits." But what makes Butler essential for this essay is not his pamphlet alone. Obviously, plenty of people have stated correct and factual things through history and received very little in recompense. It is what he did in 1933 and 1934, whenever he was presented with the opportunity, and what he said about his own personal career and experience in speeches after his retirement. Butler described what he had spent 34 years doing in Central America and Asia and the Caribbean. "I helped make Mexico, especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefits of Wall Street. The record of racketeering is long. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1909 to 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests in 1916. In China, I helped see that Standard Oil went its way unmolested." Read that list slowly. Mexico, Haiti, Cuba, Nicaragua, the Dominican Republic, China. Each country, each corporation, the word helped, doing the work of was ordered to. The United States Marine Corps, as the enforcement arm of American capital in the global South, Butler had commanded men in all of these places, received medals for his service, and emerged from it understanding precisely what he had been. He wrote and spoke about it because he considered it his obligation to say the true thing plainly. This is the colonial toolkit as first-person testimony. Not theory, not analysis, not opinion. The man who wielded it, telling you what it was for. And then in 1933, something remarkable happened. The same exact forces behind the American government, which had sent Butler to Nicaragua and Haiti to protect American banking interests, came to him with a domestic proposal. They spoke in kind but cunning words and presented him with great personal financial gain, if he chose to accept the terms of the arrangement. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt took office in the depths of the Great Depression and began implementing the New Deal, a program of government intervention, public works, financial regulation, and labor rights that the American business establishment considered a direct attack on capitalism, what Hayek's work would eventually be responding to near the close of the Second World War. They were not entirely wrong. The New Deal was an attack on the most extreme prerogatives of capital. It created the FDIC, It established the Securities and Exchange Commission. It gave labor unions the right to organize. It created Social Security. From the perspective of the American Liberty League, the Orwellian in name business organization, founded by DuPont family interests, J.P. Morgan representatives, and various other pillars of the financial establishment, Roosevelt was a dangerous populist who needed to be removed. The plot that followed was not revealed by investigative journalism, but by the man they approached to lead the coup. Butler was approached by Gerald McGuire, a bond salesman with Wall Street connections, with a proposal. Butler would lead a 500,000-man army of veterans on Washington. Roosevelt would be presented with an ultimatum: a new position in government. Effectively, a fascist strongman administrator would be created instead, and Roosevelt would either accept it or be removed. The model was explicitly what had already happened in Mussolini's Italy, and these same business interests funded Hitler's rise in Germany. Unlike the military caste behind Mussolini, Butler refused. He described it as a betrayal of the democratic and republican values that the soldiers that he'd commanded had fought for. He went to Congress and testified to the entire scheme. In his testimony, he described a conversation with McGuire about the American Legion, the veterans organization being used to recruit for the coup. You know very well that it is nothing but a strike-breaking outfit used by capital for that purpose, and that is the reason that we have all those big clubhouses, and that is the reason I pulled out from it. They have been using these dumb soldiers to break strikes. The McCormick-Dickinson Congressional Committee confirmed that the plot was in fact real. They verified it. In its report, Congress stated, "There is no question that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have even been placed into execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient." Very few people alive today should even know who J.P. Morgan is, because they should have been entirely dismantled. Instead, the financial bankers that included, according to testimony, representatives of J.P. Morgan, the DuPont family interests, Remington Arms, and the National City Bank, the same National City Bank whose revenues Butler had spent years in Haiti making decent to collect. The crucial mistake that repeats itself again and again was made actual. The men whose money had funded the operation faced no legal consequences. Just as the Confederate slavers regrouped and reinvested their capital post-Civil War, the treason committed by the capital gentry of America was given a free pass. They attempted to overthrow the United States government, and they were given a slap on the wrist, if even that. Their names were largely suppressed from the public version of the committee's report, too. Time magazine, controlled at the time by J.P. Morgan interests, ran a headline calling the plot "Moonshine" and quoting Morgan's partner Lamont, "Perfect moonshine, too utterly ridiculous to comment upon." The financial press, controlled by the people who funded the coup, called the man who exposed it a fantasist. Congress confirmed his testimony and then protected the men he named. No one was prosecuted. The same financial establishment that enslaved people in the United States and tried to overthrow the American government. The same financial establishment that had used Butler to protect Standard Oil's operations in China tried to use him to overthrow American democracy. And when he refused and exposed them, there was no recompense. This is not a footnote. This has been a repeated pattern through human history. Evil people get in power, mass murder all those who resist. Then when some normalcy has been reestablished, the careful administrators allow the mass murderers to walk free, at most just lining their own pockets and under-the-table bribes. This is a direct piece of evidence, confirmed by Congress, that the American business establishment, facing economic populism, reached for fascism as an instrument of class protection. The business plot, as I alluded to earlier, was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern, and the pattern had European precedents that were already well established. In Italy, the years 1919 and 1920 are known as the Biennio Rosso, the 2 red years. Factory workers in the industrial north occupied their factories. Agricultural laborers in the Po Valley organized and struck. The Socialist Party was growing rapidly. In response, the established liberal parliamentary order was rattled. The industrialists of Turin and Milan, the large landowners of the Po Valley and the south, were frightened. The black shirts, Mussolini's paramilitary squads, were funded by this frightened property class. They went to the countryside and beat and murdered labor organizers. They burned Socialist Party offices. They attacked local governments that were controlled by self-described socialists, and the Italian liberal parliamentary establishment watched, and largely let it happen, because the black shirts were doing something useful. They were suppressing true democracy. In October 1922, Mussolini organized the March on Rome. King Victor Emmanuel III, pressed to declare martial law and use army to stop it, declined. Instead, he invited Mussolini to form a government instead. The supposedly liberal politicians who had advised him calculated that Mussolini could be managed, used as a bulwark against communism, and contained within parliamentary norms. They were wrong about all this. They were not wrong that Mussolini served their short-term property interests. The unions were crushed and mass murdered. The factory occupations ended. The socialist movement was destroyed. The property class got what they paid for, and the cost was of human life and hope itself. The German case is more complex and involves a piece of history that tends to get lost in the standard narrative, one that is essential for this essay's argument about the left specifically. When World War I ended in November of 1918, Germany descended into revolutionary chaos. Workers' and soldiers' councils sprang up across the country. A communist revolution seemed genuinely possible. The Spartacist League, led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, launched an uprising in Berlin in January of 1919, calling for a socialist republic. The government that suppressed this uprising was not a right-wing government. It was the Social Democratic Party.
The color of moralism is blue. The official motto of Moral Intern, or Moralist International, is a blue forget-me-not, a piece of grey sky. Unofficial. For a moment, there was hope.
The Reformist Socialist Party, the Party of Labor, the moderate left. The SPD's government under Friedrich Ebert made a decision. They would use the Freikorps, paramilitary units of demobilized soldiers, many of them extreme nationalists, to crush the uprising. Rosa Luxemburg was captured, beaten, shot, and then thrown into a canal. Karl Liebknecht was also shot. The Spartacist uprising was destroyed. The liberal democratic Weimar Republic was established. The Freikorps, the proto-fascist paramilitaries that the liberal left deployed against communism in 1919, are a direct antecedent to the Nazi stormtroopers. Many of their members later joined the NSDAP. The precedent was set in the first few weeks of the Weimar Republic, when the choice was given between any sort of revolution of the people and paramilitary violence from the right. The liberal establishment grabbed for the gun. 14 years later, as the Depression devastated Germany and Nazi parties surged in elections, Germany's industrial and financial establishment faced a similar choice. The NSDAP's anti-Marxism, its promise to crush the labor movement entirely, its protection of property, these were attractive. Fritz Thyssen, one of Germany's most powerful steel magnates, was an early and significant funder. Thyssen was the most famous and the most publicly self-incriminating. He later wrote a memoir titled, I Paid Hitler, like literally. But he was not alone. Emil Kurdorf, the coal magnate who controlled the Rhenish-Westphalian coal syndicate, was an early patron, providing funds in the late 1920s and facilitating connections between the NSDAP and heavy industry. IG Farben, the chemical conglomerate that would later manufacture the Zyklon B used at Auschwitz, provided substantial corporate funding. The November 1932 Industriellnehmgabe, a petition signed by over 24 prominent industrialists and bankers, was delivered directly to President Hindenburg urging him to appoint Hitler as chancellor. Signatories included steel, banking, agricultural interests, who had concluded that a Hitler government would be more tractable than any democratic alternative. The historian Henry Ashby Turner, in German Big Business and the Rise of Hitler from 1985, argues that industrialist funding has been overstated and that the NSDAP was primarily funded by mass membership dues and small donations. Which is worth noting as a historical caveat, but Turner's argument concerns the cause of Hitler's rise, not the fact of industrial accommodation. The business class's willingness to work with Hitler once he arrived in any sort of power, to facilitate his appointment, and to benefit from the destruction of organized labor and the mass murder of German citizens that immediately followed. And that's not contested. In January 1933, former Chancellor Franz von Papen persuaded President Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as Chancellor, calculating that Hitler could be managed, an echo of what they said with Mussolini, that the conservative establishment would control the Nazi movement through its institutional positions. Within months, the Enabling Act made Hitler a dictator. Papen's theory was wrong. The property class's calculations were, again, narrowly correct in the short term. The unions were immediately mass murdered and destroyed, the communists imprisoned and also murdered, but if we assume Papen to be sincere, he was catastrophically wrong about everything else. Joyce's account of Revachol's political history is a compressed version of this pattern. The business conglomerates, the Indo-tribes, faced a revolutionary left. Most of them sided with the monarchy, which lost. The ones who survived did so because they were flexible enough to side with whoever had the cannons. First, the revolution's victorious liberals, then the coalition's occupying force. Their survival was not ideological, it was purely instrumental, like an animal scurrying around in the corners. They protected their capital interests in the things they already had and supported whoever would adapt to those deals. A mutual interest.
Every 100 years or so, our species gets together to decide what's next, who gets shot in the head, and who gets the mineral rights. It's a real kerfuffle. Those would be the communists. Generally speaking, 40 million people got shot in the head during the World Revolution. But the communists, they all got shot in the head. Oh, and the anarchists too. They shot them well. So well, one forgets they even existed. King Guillaume had a nose for bad PR. He ran before it. What is the expression? Went down? Anyway, Gil got out alive and his nephew Frisell got shot in his place. Him and tens of thousands of his wonderfully fascist kingsmen. It was a wild time. The liberals got the mineral rights. And by mineral rights, I mean everything. Some were rich enough to stay with the Constitution, with monarchy. Big mistake. Others bet on the revolution. They were called the Ultras, or Ultraliberals. They fared well. They didn't win so much as survive. We were the last ones standing when the war ended. Everyone else got shot in the head, remember? To foreign intervention. The coalition. Those people really took the mineral rights. The liberals took everything that wasn't nailed to the ground. The coalition took the ground. The ocean, the laws, and the people. The coalition of nations. The armed center of the world. They landed here and ended the revolution. It was the moralist thing to do.
There is bitterness in her voice, tempered with understanding. She is critical, but ultimately understands the cause.
The moralists believe in keeping everything exactly the way it is. They believe in mineral rights, and not shooting people in the head. At least not in the same manner and volume as the others do. They are the long-standing provisional rulers of Revachol now, the coalition government. Modernity. They developed the marvels of the inter-eastlery communication, telematic milieus, radiation, colored plastics. Meanwhile, in Revachol West, the aftermath continues for the 5th decade.
What the game is showing you, through Joyce's self-aware, half-guilty account, is that the Ultras' relationship to politics is entirely downstream of property. The Ultras did not prevent the revolution because they were fascists. They did not side with the fascists because they agreed with fascist ideology. They sided with whoever protected the arrangement that kept the mineral rights flowing. When that arrangement included fascists, they funded fascists. When it included moralist occupiers over the citizenry, they accommodated moralist occupiers. When it included, in our own world, Pinochet torturing labor organizers in Chilean stadiums, throwing them out of helicopters and putting Chilean citizens into mass graves, they called it a miracle. Scratch a liberal, a fascist bleeds is the slogan. And as a slogan, it is too absolute. There are genuine liberals, at least theoretically, who have opposed fascism at great personal risk. But as a description of structural tendencies under specific conditions, when economic populism threatens property relations, it describes something real that Butler testified to Congress about, that the Italian industrialists demonstrated in funding the black shirts, that the German business class demonstrated in the funding of the NSDAP, that the American Liberty League demonstrated in funding the business plot to overthrow the United States government. The business class's loyalty is to capital. Protecting capital is worth raping and tearing down every government, every democracy, every free place in the world. It's worth whatever else comes with the cannons. From the mass graves to nuclear annihilation, it's why the ultras, the neoliberals, are a fundamentally different type of thing than liberalism was in its foundation. The worship of power, wearing the husk and skin of dead liberalism that they themselves had gutted and carved out. The Uniparty, 1980 to 2024, Fukuyama's End of History. There's a passage in the game where Joyce describes the political history of Revachol in economic terms, and it's worth sitting with because it describes something recognizable.
The 30s? Things settled down in the 30s. Revachol East transformed itself into the world's largest tax haven, with the international community's blessing. For the first time in a long time, it was a market mirage fueled by cocaine and quantitative easing. The 40s dispelled it like a cold splash, an Isla-wide hangover, you might say.
The tax haven, the market boom, the cocaine and quantitative easing, meaning stimulants, artificial inflation and valuations, financial paper standing in for real productive capacity, the hangover, the aftermath. Sound familiar? In 1989, the Soviet Union's empire in Eastern Europe began to collapse. By 1991, the USSR was itself carved up into pieces. And Francis Fukuyama, who at the time considered himself a neoconservative, a political scientist who had published an essay in 1989 that seemed prescient, published his book, The End of History and the Last Man. Fukuyama's argument, as it was purveyed through the public context, was that the great ideological contest of the modern era was over, between liberal democracy and its rivals, particularly communist totalitarianism. Liberal democracy had won. This was not just a geopolitical victory, it was, in Fukuyama's Hegelian framing, the endpoint of history's ideological evolution point, even if he himself wasn't intending it to come across that way. Human beings had been trying out different forms of social organization for millennia. The experiment was over. Liberal capitalist democracy was the answer. There was no further stage. It could also be noted that Fukuyama's position is not static. He still lives and posts and changes at frankly Fukuyama today. He had a very good video recently on the China summit between Xi and Trump. Something instead of the true end of history was a decay and boredom by the elites from the new, unchallenged status quo. Many people theorized that stagnation would eventually lead to liberal democracy failing to make an argument for justifying itself and collapse inward. To understand why this matters for Disco Elysium, I need to explain what Hegel meant by history, because the game's entire political cosmology is built on Hegelian dialectics, and Fukuyama's claim was a deliberate deployment and somewhat misuse of Hegelian language. For Hegel, history is not just things that happened. History is the unfolding of human consciousness toward a greater self-understanding and freedom. The mass of our will, coined the zeitgeist, moves through contradictions, a thesis, an existing social arrangement, an antithesis, the contradiction within that arrangement that it cannot resolve, and finally a synthesis, the new arrangement that resolves the original contradiction but contains new contradictions of its own. This is the dialectic. It never stops in Hegel's view because each synthesis contains new contradictions. It was a mistake to think it was permanent. And I should be clear, Fukuyama's original intent wasn't that we were truly at the end point and nothing would ever happen again. But a lot of people did take it that way, that the synthesis had been achieved, the dialectic had ended. Neoliberal, ultra, capitalist democracy is the final answer. History, in Hegel's sense of the word, is over. Mill identified the intellectual condition this creates, and he was precise. John Stuart Mill on liberty, the actual liberal that I was quoting earlier. He wrote, "In the present age, which has been described as destitute of faith but terrified of skepticism, in which people feel sure not so much that their opinions are true, as that they should not know what to do with them, the claims of an opinion to be protected from public attack are rested not so much on its truth as on its importance to the society." Rewind that a bit slowly if needed. Destitute of faith, but terrified of skepticism. Sure, not that their opinions are true, but that they should not know what to do without them. This is the intellectual condition of the ultra-consensus, but especially from 1989 onward. TINA, there is no alternative, TINA, was Margaret Thatcher's explicit formulation, because it became the operating assumption of the entire transatlantic political establishment. The ultra doesn't defend market supremacy, free capital movement, structural adjustment programs, and the permanent prostration of the developing world because anyone can demonstrate that these things are true or good. The ultra defends them because they cannot imagine doing without them. The claim is protected from public attack, not on its truth, but on its importance to the society. Question the architecture, and you're not making an argument, you're threatening the foundation. You're not wrong, you're dangerous. Mill had another formulation for what this produces. The fatal tendency of mankind to leave off thinking about a thing until it is no longer doubtful is the cause of half their errors. A contemporary author has well spoken of the deep slumber of a decided opinion. This is what Fukuyama's End of History book looks like from the inside. Not a triumphant arrival at the best possible arrangement, a deep slumber, lack of faith in the system, but fear of being skeptical. The world stopped being questioned. The arrangement had calcified itself, without a rival driving further synthesis. And in Disco Elysium's cosmological terms, this is precisely what the pale is. The gray dissolution eating at the edges of reality. Islands disappearing, communities forgetting themselves, their own history, their own names. The world contracting in on itself. The pale in Disco Elysium is the deep slumber of a decided opinion given physical form. What happens to a world that has stopped believing its history can move? For a world which cannot progress eventually ceases to be a world at all. The Hegelian reading of Disco Elysium, which comes primarily through the influence of Slavov Zizek, whose book Less Than Nothing is a defense of Hegel's dialectic method and is referenced in Disco Elysium explicitly, is that the game's world is one where someone tried to do what Fukuyama described. The moralist international, the coalition, the ultra-consensus. These are the end of history made into the administered political reality. History has been stopped. The dialectic has been frozen. Revachol will perpetually be in this condition because the arrangement requires it, and the pale is the consequence. In our own world, the ultra-consensus functioned exactly this way from 1989 onward. You could debate petty things like marginal tax rates. You could argue about social issues and if gay people are allowed to get married. But the basic architecture, market supremacy, free capital movement, NATO, the WTO, the IMF structural adjustment programs, these were not up for a debate, never to be given into the hands of democracy. They were not political positions, they were reality itself. Anyone who challenged the architecture was not making an argument, they were displaying their irrationality, their naivete, their dangerousness. Let me go through the specific administrations because the details matter. Reagan, 1981 to 89. Tax cuts concentrated at the top, deregulation, the deliberate destruction of the Air Traffic Controllers Union as a signal to labor, cuts to social programs, the beginnings of mass incarceration. In foreign policy, the Chicago Boys strategy hit El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras like a truck. They were subject to death squads under U.S. funding to keep those juicy mineral rights flowing. The Reagan administration funded paramilitary organizations across Central America that tortured and murdered thousands of people. Labor organizers, priests, nuns, journalists, anyone associated with the Christian movement of liberation theology or left politics, because they were perceived as threats to U.S. strategic and economic interests. Butler had spent his career doing this work personally in an earlier era. Under Reagan, America outsourced it to local proxies. They trained at the School of the Americas at Fort Benning, Georgia, in counterinsurgency techniques whose curricula, revealed through the Freedom of Information Act requests, includes interrogation methods and the targeting of civilian opposition, blatant reneging on the First Amendment ideal that they were supposedly upholding. These tools were used there, on them, on populations the Imperial Corps' subjects didn't have to watch. A collection of militarized slave states to keep American imperial citizenry satisfied on cheap goods, rather than their own kids' arms getting eaten in sawmills. Keep that phrase in mind, the Imperial Corps and the other. The them over there. Clinton, 93 to 2001, NAFTA, Glass-Steagall repeal, welfare reform, the crime bill. In foreign policy, the Iran sanctions that killed, by UNICEF estimates, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children. Not combatants, not adults, not men, not fighters. Children. Madeleine Albright, Clinton's Secretary of State, was asked on 60 Minutes in 1996 whether the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children were worth the sanctions policy. She said, "We think the price is worth it." The price. The worth. The mineral rights logic applied to the mulched children's mass graves. Bush, 2001 to 2009. The Iraq War was a resource extraction. At this point, it's uncontroversial and acknowledged by most people. The oil ministry was the first building protected in Baghdad. But what matters most for this essay is the infrastructure that Bush built. The Patriot Act, the NSA's mass surveillance program, extraordinary rendition, the covert transfer of prisoners to other countries where they could be tortured without American legal liability, the Guantanamo detention facility, and the doctrine of enemy combatants who would be held indefinitely without trial, without charge, without access to the courts. These were tools built for the use of foreign nationals, on enemy combatants, on people outside the protection of American constitutional norms. They were used there, on them. These tools, once built, do not disappear. They are inherited by the next administration, and the next, and the next. After the horrors of torture and lies of Iraq, social fervor demanded a departure from this blue dog, Blairite, competent management that had revealed itself as nothing more than just Thatcher, just more Reagan. Obama inherited the Bush infrastructure and, with minor modifications, expanded and normalized it, rather than dismantling. Abolish ICE became framed as a fringe lefty position despite the level of authoritarian control over its own citizenry being less than 10 years old. The 2008 financial crisis is the Obama moment that most clearly illustrates the ultra-consensus in action. The crisis caused by the financial deregulation that Clinton had signed. The consequence was the worst financial crash since the Great Depression, although we're coming up on another one. With millions of Americans losing their homes, savings, and jobs, the Imperial Corps' middle class, those who escaped during the New Deal era, who had scratched just enough land ownership to avoid the cattle pen. The response was immediate and decisive on one front. The financial sector was entirely bailed out. TARP, $700 billion authorized by Congress, with trillions more in Federal Reserve backstops, protected the banks and investment houses. Not a single senior financial executive faced criminal prosecution. The Department of Justice under Eric Holder developed what critics called the too big to jail doctrine. He argued prosecuting large financial institutions would threaten the economy, so settlements without criminal accountability were preferable for everyone. The orchestrators came out unpunished and wildly richer, and those who were caught in the stream had everything taken from them, despite doing no wrong. Naomi Klein wrote the shock doctrine to describe how this system was intentional, a means of mass wealth extraction into fewer and fewer hands of ideological ultras. The settlements, when they eventually came, were civil rather than criminal. Fines paid by institutions rather than prosecutions of individuals. J.P. Morgan Chase settled with the Department of Justice in 2013 for $13 billion in taxpayer money. Keep in mind, J.P. Morgan Chase was already caught trying to overthrow the American government 70 years prior. They shouldn't have even existed as a company to receive bailout money from. But we never learn from our mistakes, from the Confederacy to the business plot to 2008. And at the time, this JP Morgan Chase settlement was the single largest one in American history, although not for long. For their role in packaging and selling fraudulent mortgage securities, they got a huge payout. And that payout, what is it? Taxpayer money. The taxpayer money compensated the very people who removed the taxpayers from their homes. Bank of America settled for $16.65 billion in 2014, just a year later, already topping the total settlement record set by Chase. Citigroup, that's another recognizable name, settled for $7 billion. Goldman Sachs settled for $5 billion in 2016. In every case, the settlement was presented as accountability. In every case, no senior executive was prosecuted. In every case, the settlement amount was a fraction of the profits generated by the conduct being settled. JP Morgan's $13 billion settlement represented approximately 1 year's profit. Eric Holder, again Obama's Attorney General, later acknowledged in a 2013 Senate testimony that the size of some financial institutions made prosecution difficult because of the negative effects that it would have on the economy, similar to Pam Bondi's recent argument in not jailing the child rapists and murderers in the Epstein class, found in the Epstein files. This math is a function, a formulation that means, translated plainly, that the institutions had become too essential to be held to the same law as everyone else. The death of law. The legal category of too big to jail is not a metaphor. It was stated and enacted policy, and it's continued to be, as things have only gotten more decrepit, depraved, and corrupt. The response to ordinary Americans who had lost their homes was far less decisive, and in fact almost like another multiple stab wounds being inserted into their back. The Home Affordability Modification Program was systematically under-implemented, partly because the banks administering it had financial incentives not to modify loans. The Special Inspector General for TARP, SIGTARP, SIGTARP, issued a series of reports documenting what had happened to HAMP, H-A-M-P, in granular detail. The Treasury Department had projected that HAMP would help 3 to 4 million homeowners obtain permanent loan modifications. By the time the program wound down, approximately 1.5 million permanent modifications had been completed. But the numbers obscure the specific mechanism of failure. Banks, the same banks receiving TARP bailout money, were also the servicers administering HAMP. They had financial incentives to foreclose rather than modify, fees collected during foreclosure proceedings, the ability to recover full outstanding balances rather than negotiated ones, and accounting treatments that made modifications look worse on balance sheets than foreclosures. SIGTARP's 2014 report found that the 5 largest TARP mortgage services have denied more than 70% of homeowner applications. Somehow, even more damningly, many homeowners were placed in trial modifications, temporary reductions in payments while applications were being reviewed. Then, after the reviews went on, they were denied permanent modifications after months of compliance, leaving them in a worse financial position than they had been if they had never applied in the first place. Meaning the government set up systems for them to get help that actually cost them more money than just the initial pain. The banks collected $7.6 billion in incentive payments from the government for administrating a program which systematically robbed the American people. Their homes were lost, and then the people who trusted the government enough to ask for some help were similarly robbed a second time. The homes were lost, the banks were saved. The arrangement was maintained and further stratified into the pre-New Deal standards, to where today we have greater than Gilded Age level of wealth inequality. We furnish the means by which we suffer. As I quoted from Paine earlier, the people whose taxes funded the bailout of the institutions whose deregulation caused the crisis paid for their own dispossession. Obama also maintained and expanded the drone assassination program, conducting strikes in countries that the U.S. was not formally at war with. He prosecuted more whistleblowers under the Espionage Act than all previous presidents combined. he gave the green light on extrajudicial assassination of American citizens abroad as an acceptable casualty for American interests. The NSA's mass surveillance program, revealed by Edward Snowden in 2013, had expanded substantially under his watch. These were, again, tools used primarily on foreign populations and on citizens deemed threats. Used there, on them, unless you're an American who's over there, at least it's not here. We wouldn't kill our own people here. We're not barbarians. Biden, 2021 to 2025. The partial break from the Ultra Consensus, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, some genuine Keynesian economic policy not seen since the 1960s were actually enforced, although substantially gutted and shot down by extra-ultra Democrats like Joe Manchin and Kirsten Gillibrand. Despite their success in stabbing their own constituents, these are real and worth acknowledging accomplishments of the Biden regime, and a reprieve from Trump's continuation of what was mostly just the exact same ultra theology in his first term. But foreign policy remains squarely within the ultra framework. Gaza policy, unquestioning allegiance to the corporate haven of Israel in arms deals for U.S. companies, even in the face of open genocide. Despite propaganda to the contrary, border policy set deportation records. The architecture of ultraliberalism remained abroad, and for them, there, while easing a little bit on the population of the imperial core, who had been essentially robbed blind for the last 30 years straight, because the middle class was already hollowed out. The real money for American interests did not break with it. The arms dealers and gun manufacturers, those were all prioritized for conflicts abroad.
The moralists believe in keeping everything exactly the way it is. They believe in mineral rights, and not shooting people in the head. At least not in the same manner and volume as the others do. They are the long-standing provisional rulers of Revachol now, the coalition government.
40 years of American ultra in one game mechanic. The deep slumber of a decided opinion. Revachol administered in perpetuity and decline. Welcome to reality. When the tools come home, fascism and the colonial toolkit. I need to return to John Stuart Mill once again. I told you at the end of the introduction that we'd come back to the most important thing that Mill wrote. Here it is. In the same text as the social tyranny passage, in the same work as the harm principle being outlined, the defense of free expression, the assault of the tyranny of prevailing opinion, John Stuart Mill also wrote this. For the same reason, we may leave out of consideration those backward states of society in which the race itself may be considered as in its nonage. Despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians, provided the end be their improvement, and the means justified by actually effecting that end. Liberty, as a principle, has no application to any state of things anterior to the time when mankind have become capable of being improved by free and equal discussion. Read for emphasis, the harm principle, the cornerstone of classical liberalism. The argument that the only legitimate reason to exercise power over another person is to prevent harm to others explicitly does not apply to barbarians. Despotism is a legitimate mode of government for people who have not yet been capable of being improved by free and equal discussion. The harm principle has a geographical and racial boundary built directly into its foundational text. It's easy to see how this comment of intrigued barbarism became conflated with any challenge to the redefined, only true freedom, market freedom. No matter how well educated, how well spoken, how civilized you may be, the ultras, the neoliberal guards and their agenda, was to recharacterize those challengers as the exact barbarians to crush by force. Mill is not an outlier here. He is describing the consensus of liberal tradition. Locke's natural rights excluded people without property. Jefferson's self-evident equality excluded enslaved people and women. And that's partially because we needed an educated populace in order to make properly educated decisions. The Enlightenment's emancipatory vocabulary was written by and for a specific group of people. The all men, in all men being originally equals, had always been doing a specific kind of work, in who gets considered a man. It's Aristotelian in some sense. The man is a political animal, and the ability to introspect and rationalize sets man apart from the animal. That's the general adage. The uneducated, the mindless consumers, the workers, the cattle in the pen are justified as less than human, even in the original liberal construction, but redefined and amplified under the ultra framework. Disco Elysium's dock workers aren't people, like the Wild Pine Group is a person. The souls and self-determination of a human life is not granted by being ends in of themselves, but by inheriting ends, a more calcified layer to justify what neoliberalism in function actually is, reformed feudalism. This changes the essay's central argument in this section. Originally, when I was writing this, though I had hinted otherwise, the thesis that extraordinary powers built under Bush and refined under Obama are the colonial toolkit coming home, and in some sense, they always dwelt under the surface like a swamp gas. That the liberal establishment built a toolkit for use on foreign populations and is now discovering that toolkit can be turned inward, as larger portions of the imperial core are undereducated, underserved, and put back into a pre-New Deal meat grinder. The fact that this framework was in John Stuart Mill changes the thesis a little bit of this project, but it's more honest. The colonial toolkit is not a betrayal of classical liberalism's principles. It is an application of them after the two horns of contradiction in liberalism of people's rights and the right of land fight each other. Land eats the equality out of liberalism in order to resolve its internal contradiction, and it wins because from conception, the land class owned the cannons. Mill wrote the intellectual charter for imperial administration in the same book where he wrote the most beautiful defense of liberty in the English language. The harm principle was always geographically bounded. It was always for some people and not others. The shock of the tools coming home is not that the tools exist, they were always consistent with some of liberalism's foundational texts, just in contradiction. When applied to people, those texts explicitly excluded. The shock is that they are being applied to the constituencies those texts were written to protect. Smedley Butler knew this. He spent 34 years being the harm principle's exception made flesh. And when he came home and wrote War is a Racket and exposed the coup to overthrow the American government, it was because he understood that the ruffians' protection racket had been operating all along, just at a safe enough distance that the protected class didn't have to see it. With that in mind, let me look at what was built, what it was for, and what is happening to it right now. Return to Chile. September 11th, 1973, in the Pinochet coup. The torture chambers, the disappeared masses, the Chicago Boys implementing Friedman's program in its purest form, requiring extraordinary political conditions. Dictatorship, meaning a government that could arrest and kill the opposition. That was the only way it could function. This was not a one-off, it was the template. The School of the Americas, renamed the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation in 2001, trained tens of thousands of Latin American military officers in counterinsurgency techniques. Its graduates have included some of the most documented perpetrators of mass atrocity in the 20th century Latin America. Roberto de Abusin, the Salvadorian death squad organizer, widely documented as having ordered the assassination of Archbishop Romero, received U.S. military training. General Efrain Rios Montt of Guatemala, convicted of genocide by the Guatemalan court in 2013 for the massacre of Maya communities, a conviction later overturned on procedural grounds. He received U.S. military training too. Hugo Banzer, who led a coup in Bolivia in 1971 and oversaw a regime of torture, disappearance, and mass death, received U.S. training. The Atlacatl Battalion, the elite Salvadoran Rapid Reaction Unit created in 1980 and trained directly by U.S. Special Forces at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, carried out the El Mozote massacre in December of 1981, killing an estimated 800 to 1,000 civilians, primarily women, children, and elderly people, in a village in the Morazan province. Journalist Mark Danner documented the massacre in detail in his 1993 book, The Massacre at El Mozote. The Reagan administration, when confronted with early reports of this, denied that it had occurred and pressured journalists and congressional investigators to drop the story. That same Atlacatal battalion murdered 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper, and her 15-year-old daughter at the University of Central America in San Salvador in November 1989. 9 of the 27 Salvadoran officers cited in connection with the murders had received training at the School of the Americas. The curricula included surveillance methods, interrogation techniques, and the targeting of civilian opposition. This was the systematic global export of a toolkit for suppressing democracy in order to institute anti-democratic ultra-economics in the global south. In El Salvador in the 1980s, the U.S.-funded government and its associated death squads murdered an estimated 75,000 people during the Civil War. Archbishop Oscar Romero, as I mentioned, was shot, but he was shot while saying Mass in 1980, in the middle of a Christian service. After he wrote to President Carter asking him to stop military aid, he was targeted. The American system of government, that since the Cold War had cosplayed itself as representing Christian values, consistently spent the 60s through 90s murdering Christians in the nations that were considered barbaric and below human consideration and value. Just dwell on that. Shot an archbishop during Holy Mass. The demons are all around us. In Guatemala, the CIA-backed coup in 1954 overthrew the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenez, whose crime was attempting to redistribute unused United Fruit Company land to landless peasants. In response, the CIA installed a series of military dictatorships. The subsequent decades saw genocide against Maya communities, with an estimated 200,000 killed. The UN-sponsored Historical Clarification Commission, the Comisión para el Esclarecimiento Histórico, or CEH, delivered its report in 1999 after 2 years of investigation. It documented 626 massacres. That's not 626 deaths, that's massacre events. It found that state security forces and allied paramilitary groups were responsible for 93% of documented human rights violations. It found that acts of genocide had been committed against the Ixil Maya, Aji Maya, Hui Maya, and okay, listen, you can tell by now, I'm not Spanish heritage. I don't know how to pronounce any of this stuff, so I'm putting it on the screen. It was documented forced disappearances, torture, rape as a weapon of systematic terror. That is, not just that there were rapes, but that they intentionally raped people to inflict terror. And the deliberate destruction of communities' cultural and religious practices. The total death toll was an estimated over 200,000, with a further 45,000 disappeared. The commission found that U.S. government support for Guatemalan military and intelligence apparatus contributed directly to the human rights violations it documented. The CIA's 1954 coup that installed the first military dictatorship, the one that removed Arbenz and his land reform program, was the event that the commission identified as initiating the conditions that produced 40 years of state terror. The United Fruit Company's mineral rights. 40 years. 200,000 dead. And in all of those places, the tools were mass arrest, torture, execution, disappearance, suspension of habeas corpus, surveillance, criminalization of political speech and association, targeting of journalists, academics, lawyers, anyone who might organize resistance or be able to dream up a less demon-infested world. These were considered acceptable because they were happening there, to them, to people Mill's harm principle explicitly did not cover, to populations the Enlightenment emancipatory vocabulary had never been written for, to the barbarians for whom despotism is a legitimate mode of government. When the civil rights movement threatened to keep FDR's legacy moving forward, the CIA shot Fred Hampton while he laid in bed. They killed Martin Luther King Jr. Kennedy co-opted black liberation struggle into the March on Washington, pacifying the movement even as the U.S. government continued to work against them, like with Reagan's administration distributing crack into underprivileged communities, and Clinton continuing to escalate the mass incarcerations and lack of prison rights. Now, what did Bush build after 9/11? The Patriot Act expanded surveillance authority and reduced judicial oversight. The AUMF authorized military action in countries not named in the original authorization. The NSA's PRISM program collected communications data on a mass scale, including on American citizens, a blatant violation of the Bill of Rights. The FISA court, FISA, approved nearly every warrant request it received. Extraordinary rendition transferred prisoners to countries where they could be tortured without American legal liability. Guantanamo held indefinitely without charge, without trial, without access to courts, no places to report their tortures, when or if they ever got out alive. Obama was elected on an overwhelming mandate of change and yet completely betrayed his promises. He refined and expanded this toolkit. He explicitly claimed the authority to order the killing of American citizens abroad deemed threats. This power was used in the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki in 2011. His son, Abdul al-Awlaki, was born in Denver, Colorado. He was 16 years old. He was not a combatant, was not on any targeting list, and was eating dinner with his cousins in Yemen when a drone strike killed him on October 14th, 2011. 2 weeks after a separate strike killed his father. When Robert Gibbs, former White House press secretary and then a senior advisor to the Obama campaign, was asked about Abdul's killing in a 2012 interview, he replied, I would suggest that you should have had a more responsible father if you're truly concerned about the well-being of their children. The formulation is worth sitting with. A 16-year-old American citizen killed without trial in an explosion, without charge, without any legal process whatsoever. And the administration's response was that the responsibility lay with the child for the choices of his father. This is the logic of collective punishment applied to an American child by the American government. It is the colonial toolkit's moral grammar applied to someone whose citizenship should have placed him beyond its reach. These tools were built for on them, on foreign nationals, on enemy combatants, on people outside of the protection of American constitutional norms, on those less than human beings who are just meant to be slaves making things for the imperial core. And then they increasingly have started to come home. What is qualitatively different about the Trump second term is not the existence of authoritarian impulse in the American government. What is different is the systematic application of the tools of colonial governments to domestic political opposition, not primarily to communities of color who have faced these tools for decades, not to foreign nationals, but to visible mainstream political figures, journalists, and activists who are a part of the normal discourse of American democracy. The shooting of Alex Preddy in Minnesota, himself a nurse who worked at the VA, a veteran's doctor, was called a terrorist after a group of armed thugs disarmed him on video, put him on his knees, and executed him by shooting him in the back of the head. Thomas Paine wrote in 1776, in the free countries, that the law ought to be the real king. In America, the law is king, for as is absolute the king is law, so in free countries the law ought to be king, and there ought be no other. What we are watching is the principled dismantling of precisely that claim, that law does not rule over people, but that the powerful can selectively ignore the law, and the real purpose of the law is to keep the cattle inside their pen. The Trump administration's use of the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 to deport Venezuelan nationals to El Salvador without individual hearings generated court challenges the administration initially defied. These acts of defiance were definitional treason. The right of detained persons to challenge their detention before a court, established in the Magna Carta and carried into American constitutional law and British common law before it, is arguably the most fundamental protection in the common law tradition. When the administration argues that the executive has the authority to detain and remove without judicial review, it is claiming a power that colonial governance routinely exercises over barbarians, but that constitutional governance has historically forbidden at home, or seen the breaking of as an absolute violation, since it is the basis for the distinction between the barbarians and non-barbarians. The barbarians' exception applied domestically places the feudal entrenchment into full attire. For months now, we have been sanctioning and blockading Cuba, keeping even Mexico from sending in emergency oil shipments, with only slight relief coming in the last few weeks. There were times where during the blockade, as Ryan Grimm of Dropsite News reported, that the gas would run out or be rationed in hospitals, requiring doctors and nurses to quickly turn on flashlights and rush to the hand-crank generators so that the babies on ventilators would not suffocate to death. In response to these horrors, a small group of activists and influencers from the United States who followed legal protocol to deliver a small bit of aid, ramen noodles and basic amenities, were subpoenaed, at least as reported by Fox, by the federal government, American streamer Hassan Piker and Code Pink founder Medea Benjamin being the primary ones listed for their part in the activity, the legal activity. Still, no subpoenas have been issued for the billionaires and business executives caught raping children on Epstein's Island. In response to the news was an applauding uproar from the ultraliberals in the Democratic Party, seemingly happy to see an American influencer targeted by the federal government for their basic right. The United Kingdom days later revoked the visas of Hassan to the United Kingdom for criticism of the nation-state Israel's actions and mass murder, because Western democracy is a theater controlled by middle managers who wear the rotting corpse of liberalism on their backs like wolves in sheep's clothing, acting as managers, pen administrators meant to lead cattle back into their pens, and electrifying the fence if one wanders too far. This is not what the American Revolution was for. This is not what the French Revolution dreamed of what liberalism's purpose of escaping monarchy dreamed of. This is the same malicious actors with the same cannons re-entrenching feudalism with the paint of democracy. What matters for this essay's argument is the category of act being investigated. Travel to Cuba by American citizens while subject to licensing requirements is not a crime. Political speech about U.S.-Cuba relations is protected by the First Amendment. The investigation of these activities as potential national security violations is an attempt to use national security law developed for use against foreign intelligence threats, refined through decades of application to populations in Chile and El Salvador and Guatemala, to criminalize legal political activity by relabeling it as a security threat. This is the colonial toolkit operating on domestic soil. It is the barbarians administering the definition of a barbarian. Just recently, the Trump administration removed Stephen Colbert from the Late Night Show for jokes at the president's expense. Then, Trump posted an AI video of himself forcibly picking Colbert off the stage and throwing him in the dumpster. Paramount was willing to comply despite high ratings of the show because they want Trump to approve a further merger that entrenches even further the media monopolies of the United States. The conjunction of media companies' regulatory vulnerability and the disappearance of an opposition voice does not require explicit direct coercion to function as suppression, though the posting of that AI video kinda gives the game away. The mechanism can be regulatory leverage, advertiser pressure, corporate self-censorship in anticipation of consequences, and the aesthetic dimension, a sitting president publicly posting a video of himself throwing a political opponent into the dumpster and getting them fired. This is the aesthetics of authoritarian contempt. It communicates to everyone watching that the administration considers its opponents available for humiliation and removal, that the voices and the rights of the citizenry is fundamentally less than the oligarchy and its collective business interests. The message functions independently of whether or not the mechanism is direct. The shift from Christian nationalist rhetoric to Christian nationalist policy represents a meaningful change when religious freedom executive orders create exemptions from civil rights law on the basis of religious objection. The policy is not protecting religious freedom in the classical liberal sense. It is elevating one set of religious commitments to a position of legal authority over others. The explicitly nationalist blood and soil flavor of Christianity is a culturally conservative and repressive one, which is neither representative of Christian doctrine or of American history. Forcing the culture to abandon alternative viewpoints, ones which can challenge the power of those born to rich families, are not desirable. Where previously the ultras had detached the right of the people to democratically change economic policy, left to fight over scraps of business irrelevant social conflict, now even the social content could be more counter-institutional than was acceptable for them. The managed decline of education and human self-reflection to fill their true role, cattle in the pen. The suppression of voting rights is the most fundamental way a government can insulate itself from democratic accountability, the first right that Thomas Paine and other founders fought to establish, and the one most directly targeted by tools of colonial governance whenever those tools have been applied. The Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act, the last major accomplishment of the post-FDR civil rights era before it was snuffed out. In less than 24 hours, and without even proposing a vote or referendum, the historic Confederate states redrew their maps to make voting rights more obsolete for all minorities, and especially of the black population, ensuring black districts were always a minority and could only ever serve to somewhat sway and never define districts. The inclusion of need for a passport, something which is nearly $200 and takes 6 to 8 weeks to receive after being approved, or the requirement for re-registration to vote among those with last name changes in policy, aka around 70 million married women. Due to the historic position of women in society, not gaining the right to vote until the 20s, women are more likely to grapple with their historical disenfranchisement. By systematically devoicing the people most likely to vote against your business interests, you don't even have to kill them. Even the publishing of this video is part of the social stratification. My compiling of this information is not a broad threat to the oligarchy because of the people who will be educated enough, the people who will own the technology, the ones who speak my language, who have the ability to grasp on the basic historical information this video has to make sense. All of those things have been algorithmically weeded out from receiving the message of my video. Those in poor developmental conditions from birth, those with brains fried on short-form content or lead poisoning, those caught in the alluring cycle of consumerism as a first and last order priority, their daily cycles and the options that they have been given guide them down, circling inside the pen and never looking through the electric fence on the outside, because they have been trained to avoid the fence, because they can try to settle for the crumbs that they are given in the center until they are harvested by the system. The system has done just what John Stuart Mill warned of in Social Tyranny of Stratified Class Interests, made manifest across all domains of life. The distinction this essay has been building toward. Bush's illiberalism was directed outwards, on foreign populations, on vassal states, on enemy combatants, on communities at domestic periphery. What we are watching in the Trump term is the colonial toolkit being turned inward, on the imperial core's own mainstream political culture, on the acceptance that the imperial core is no longer the citizens of the imperial core, but the masters and managers of those people. This is not a claim that what is happening now is worse than what has happened to people in Chile or El Salvador or Guatemala. It objectively is not. The claim is different. The framework that permitted those things to be done there is now being applied here. The legal and institutional structures built to conduct colonial governance are being repurposed for domestic political use, and the people who were comfortable with those structures when they were applied there are now discovering with evident surprise that the structures do not inherently care about this distinction. John Stuart Mill's harm principle always had a geographical boundary. The boundary is moving to cover a smaller diameter.
With due respect to our overlords, the eternal caretaker government that keeps Martinaise a monument to the efficacy of its artillery, I would not have relinquished sovereignty to the coalition. Not here in Martinaise, and not in the Stella Maris or Delta Beachheads either. If not for my own sake, then for my daughters. We had an obligation to defend our sovereignty. We should have burned the whole Isola down rather than let them have it.
Dark orange flames reflect in her green eyes, an oil fire on the ocean.
Yes. Whatever else I am, I'm also a mother and a wife. Now, shall we return to reality?
Joyce draws a line here. She would have resisted. Not for Martinez, not for the people of the city, but for her own daughters, for her line's sovereignty. The Ultra draws a limit at the point where the colonial apparatus turns on her people, her family, her property, not at the point where it turns on the people of Martinez. The principle is not freedom, the principle is proximity and an animal survival instinct. After news broke about the investigation of Hassan Piker and Medea Benjamin, after it became clear that the Trump administration was using national security apparatus to investigate people for legal travel and political speech, a significant portion of the mainstream liberal commentariat's reaction was not solidarity, it was satisfaction. FAFO, people said. The argument stated plainly, Piker and Benjamin had criticized the Democratic Party. They had argued that the Democrats were not sufficiently distinct from Republicans on economic issues, on foreign policy, on Gaza. They had called out the Democratic politicians by name. They had declined to uncondition their support of the party that considered itself the opposition. And therefore, the logic went, they had weakened the coalition, contributed to Democratic electoral failures, and should not be surprised when the Republicans came for them. They made their beds. I want to linger on this response, but first, I want to deploy Mill one more time, because Mill described this dynamic precisely. He wrote, "Social intolerance kills no one, roots out no opinions, but induces men to disguise them, or to abstain from any active effort for their diffusion. With us, heretical opinions do not perceptibly gain or even lose ground in each decade or generation. They never blaze out far and wide, but continue to smolder in the narrow circles of thinking and studious persons among whom they originate, without ever lighting up the general affairs of mankind with either a true or a deceptive light, and thus is kept up a state of things very satisfactory to some minds, because without the unpleasant process of fining or imprisoning anybody, it maintains all prevailing opinions outwardly undisturbed. But the price paid for this is a sort of intellectual pacification. It is the sacrifice of the entire moral courage of the human mind. Intellectual pacification. The FAFO ultraliberals are purchasing exactly this, a state of things, very satisfactory to some minds, because without the unpleasant process of fining or imprisoning anybody, it maintains all prevailing opinions outwardly undisturbed. The suppression of the left does the same work. And the price, as Mill identifies, is the sacrifice of the entire moral courage of the human mind. What is particularly striking about Mill's formulation is that he is not making any sort of, lefty, Bernie critique of liberalism. He is one of the fathers of liberalism. He's making a liberal critique of the liberal tendency toward intellectual pacification. He is using the liberal tradition against the people who claim it while misusing it. This is the same move the essay is making. The FAFO position has a coherent internal logic. Solidarity is conditional on loyalty to the party. If you have criticized the party, the Democratic Party, as the only vehicle for opposing Republicans, you have forfeited the right to expect defense from within that coalition. It also has a historical precedent that should alarm anyone who recognizes it. In January 1919, when the SPD government of Friedrich Ebert deployed the Freikorps to crush the Spartacist uprising and murder Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, the reason was structurally identical. The Spartacists had pushed a little too hard, complained a little too much. They had challenged the liberal democratic order's legitimacy. They had demanded that the revolution go further than the SPD was willing to take it, even through democratic appeals. The SPD had, in some sense, abandoned democracy. They were insufficiently loyal to the coalition of forces that had unseated the Kaiser and established the Weimar Republic. And so when Ebert sent the Freikorps, they could not expect protection from the forces they had criticized. The Freikorps were not the SPD's ideological allies. They were the proto-fascist paramilitaries who would go on to form the nucleus of the Nazi movement. The SPD deployed them anyway, because they were useful for suppressing the left at that moment. The FAFO liberals are not deploying paramilitary forces. The analogy is not literal, but the structure of the logic is the same. When forced to choose between protecting critics on the left and allowing right-wing suppression of those critics, the ultra tendency chooses the latter, not because they are in principle fascists, but because the critics of the left threaten their position of power, their role as legitimate opposition, more immediately than the fascists who are suppressing those critics. The same thing happens when insurgent left-wing candidates work within the Democratic Party for things that the party was associated with prior to the Blue Dog wave taking over in the 90s. This is the ultras' conditional anti-fascism in contemporary form. Anti-fascism when fascism threatens ultra interests, intellectual pacification when fascism goes after someone who has made their interests uncomfortable.
In her green eyes, you see a mixture of truth and self-satire. Decades of guilt and pride.
Joyce's guilt is real. The game is careful about this. She's not a cartoon villain. She knows what her class did in Revachol. She knows it was their guile, the clever, slithering, and lack of willingness to take risks that handed the bullets to the moral intern that killed the hope of the revolution, that befriended and worked alongside the revolutionaries until it was no longer to their own personal, immediate benefit as the least risky move. The guilt is genuine, and the pride is also genuine. Joyce even admits at one point that perhaps she would have preferred if the revolution had won, but they didn't. The pride of having survived, of having been competent, of having made the hard calculations and come out of the other side. The game extends sympathy for her, understanding why someone made the choices they made, not the kind that means those choices were acceptable. This is the game's political maturity, and one of the things that distinguishes it from simpler political fiction. It does not make the Ultra a cartoon character. It makes her a full person, fully capable of genuine feeling of moral decay. And it still shows you what her ideology costs, in full and without flinching. She is the reason Martinez looks the way it does. She is the reason that the Pale is eating the world from the inside out. The sympathy and the condemnation coexist, as they must in honest political analysis. Understanding why something happened does not mean it was acceptable.
By virtue of their survival, they were handed enormous power to shape the future. This was all our last generation managed.
This was all our last generation managed. She's not proud of it. She's not defensive about it. She's simply accurately looking at the situation. The people who survived the 20th century ideological conflicts, who bet on the right cannons, who accommodated the right occupiers, who were flexible enough not to be shot in the head, were handed enormous power, and they built this. The tax haven, the market mirage, the managed ruin, the theater of democracy. The 40-year aftermath that shows no sign of ending before Elysium's world itself does. And when the fascist movement that their framework always had the potential to generate arrived and pointed its tools inward, enough of them said, FAFO. Why ultra and not liberal? The name and what it costs. Why does the word matter? Why spend the time arguing about whether or not we should say liberal or ultra-liberal or neoliberal or neoconservative? More so, why we shouldn't pass off the term neoliberal as if it is a momentary succession of liberal ideology, rather than the result of land killing the individual. An instance of liberalism's internal contradiction eating one half of itself. It's not new. It is feudalism in a liberal coat. The word liberal in American political discourse does two things simultaneously that need to be separated. It describes current political formation, the Democratic Party's coalition, broadly speaking, and it invokes the inheritance of classical liberalism, Paine, Mill, Locke, the Enlightenment's emancipatory project, and Kant. When someone calls Biden or Obama or Clinton liberal, they are implicitly connecting those politicians' policies to the tradition of freedom of conscience, limiting power, and protecting individual rights from concentrated authority. Unless you talk to like a troglodyte, then they mean like they're a communist by liberal, and they're just totally incoherent. The legitimate meaning and connection is not warranted though, and their neoliberal politics is an objective betrayal of those values, at least half of them. The Patriot Act that the Democratic Senate voted for was an assault on the civil liberties tradition. The bank bailout that prioritized property over persons was the opposite of the tradition grounding property rights in the revolution that started America, and in the protection of persons. The drone program executing American citizens without trial across the globe was the opposite of the due process Magna Carta tradition. The support for structural adjustment programs maintaining developing nations in permanent debt dependency was the opposite of Paine's anti-colonial logic. A long habit of not thinking a thing wrong gives it a superficial appearance of being right, he wrote in the introduction to Common Sense. And the habit of calling ultra-economics liberal has given it exactly that superficial appearance, when it in action has killed every good, every revolutionary and Enlightenment impulse that gave it the power from monarchy in the first place. Using liberal for this formation obscures the problem. If the Democratic Party is liberal, then the critique of its policies sound like an attack on liberalism, on freedom, on Enlightenment values. The word functions as a rhetorical shield. You cannot criticize the mineral rights without appearing to criticize the forget-me-nots. Ultra cuts through this. It says, this is not Paine's liberalism or Mill's liberalism. This is not American or French revolutionary liberalism. This is something that emerged from within that tradition, intensified and evolved into its most extractive tendencies, stabbed the heart of its emancipatory commitments, and kept the vocabulary as a cover. It is liberalism taken to its logical extreme by the property class, its class interests followed through without ameliorating contradictions. And Mill himself identified the mechanism. The morality of an ascendant class emanates from its class interests. The ultra-morality is market freedom, because market freedom is what the ascendant class benefits from. They retained the vocabulary of Thomas Paine while implementing the logic of Pinochet's Chicago Boys and reinforcing the power of international feudal fiefdoms. Ultra also has the virtue of being the word its most honest practitioners use for themselves. Joyce claims it. No sane person claims it in broad daylight, meaning the ideology is real, the practice is widespread, but the word is suppressed because the word tells you too much. Retrieving the word is retrieving the honesty about what the thing actually is. Similarly, calling Trump's movement conservative obscures rather than illuminates. American conservatism, even in its recent degraded forms, had commitments to constitutional limits on executive power, to free trade and international institutions, to procedural democracy, even when its outcomes were inconvenient. The current administration has abandoned all of these. The unitary executive theory explicitly says that the leader, the executive, controls all the actions of government, can bypass the few restrictions and checks and balances placed by Congress. It's a theory like Bigfoot is a theory, not like gravity is. What remains is not conservatism, because nothing is being conserved. It is a political formation characterized by the demonization of Thatcher's enemy from within, the embrace of extra-legal executive power, the subordination of judicial and legislative institutions to executive will, the use of the state to suppress political opposition, the cultivation of a personality cult, and the exploitation of democratic mechanisms to undermine democracy itself. These are definitional features of fascism. Using the word is not rhetoric. It's a fact. And this matters because the ultras need the mislabeling. The FAFO liberals who are comfortable with the Trump administration going after leftist commentators are comfortable partly because they have not named what is happening correctly. If the Piker subpoena is just a legal matter or a misreport, if the Colbert situation is just a corporate decision, if deportation without hearings is just immigration enforcement rather than a break in Magna Carta baseline law, then there is nothing to defend, nothing to resist, nothing that ruptures the deep slumber of a decided opinion. But if these are the colonial toolkit applied domestically by a fascist administration, aided by the ultra-class's tactical indifference, then something quite different is called for. The sanity Joyce is describing is the sanity of self-preservation, not the sanity of accuracy. Naming what things are, in broad daylight, even when no sane person does it, that is the precondition for anything else to follow. The nature of neoliberalism, of the ultras, is this strategic dishonesty. To say it in broad daylight as an ultra is to abandon your system of competency. That honesty from Joyce is what can be truly appreciated in her most human moments. Disco Elysium ends Harry Dubois, a broken detective who has lost everything, standing in a field and choosing against all evidence to keep going. The world is dissolving. The Pale is at the edges. The political project of the Commune was crushed decades ago. The moralist administration continues to manage an interminable decline. Nothing has been fixed. The choice is simply whether we continue or not. This is not a triumphant ending. It is something more honest, and that honesty itself is difficult to meet eyes with. The recognition that the alternative to continuing is the Pale, and that the Pale is what despair looks like when it becomes total. When the dialectic truly reaches its end, not due to the synthesis resolving its contradictions, but by the power to change it being snuffed out and permitting only its self-collapse and decay. The Pale, as I said from the outset, is the game's cosmological representation of what happens when history stops, when the dialectic is frozen, when the ultra-consensus announces that there is no alternative, that the current arrangement is reality itself. Welcome to reality, baby! The world responds by beginning to dissolve, not dramatically and not all at once, just at the edges. Islands disappearing, communities forgetting their own identities and sense of purpose, their reason to live rather than punch their ticket. The world contracting on itself, the deep slumber of a decided opinion made physical. The Pale is Fukuyama's end of history from inside it. Not the triumphant culmination of human progress, the gray unraveling of collective meaning. Sam Criss opens his Blair essay with an Engels epigraph, which I referenced earlier, but I will now read. In the Hegelian system, the history of mankind no longer appeared as a wild whirl of senseless deeds of violence, all equally condemnable at the judgment seat of mature philosophic reason, but as the process of evolution of man's mind himself. This is what the Ultra Project denies. History as the process of our evolutions. The dialectic moving, contradictions generating synthesis. Progress. The world capable of being something other than what it currently is. The Ultra says, it is what it is. We are past the time of ideology. Since Disco Elysium lets you adopt any number of ideologies, if you do a communist run, the deserter, who was one of those revolutionaries who has been hiding out for decades, the deserter mocks you if you do a communist run, saying all the real communists are dead. The mineral rights are the mineral rights. Welcome to reality. Mill offered the liberal tradition's version of the same argument. He wrote that what kept Europe from stagnating into a Chinese conformism was their remarkable diversity of character and culture. The contest between them constitutes the chief interest of the history of mankind. The only unfailing and permanent source of improvement is liberty. Movement requires contention. The dialectic moves through opposition. The deep slumber of a decided opinion, as I've repeated of Mill's phrase, is the condition the Ultra Project requires. TINA, is not an economic policy, it's a horse-grade dose of melatonin. The Pale advances when the sleep becomes total. And this connects back to Chris and to Joyce, because Chris's argument about Blair, and through Blair, about the ultratype, is precisely this. We stop believing in the old categories, the old frameworks for understanding what power does and who it serves, and so when the Blair type arrives wearing the Enlightenment's face, we call it progress. The Balfour's feast that turned out to be dirt, the dead dogma mistaken for living truth, the liberation vocabulary mistaken for liberation itself. Thomas Paine had a different formulation for what was possible. He wrote it during a war that he didn't even know would be won. In a pamphlet he wrote for taverns, for a hope of an American Revolution and of a true city shining on a hill. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. A situation similar to the present hath not happened since the days of Noah until now. The birthday of a new world is at hand. Paine understood perfectly well that the principal ruffian's protection racket was the origin of the arrangement he was fighting. He understood that what he called the cause of all mankind could not be stolen by interested men who are not to be trusted, weak men who cannot see, prejudiced men who will not see, and a certain set of moderate men who think better of the European world than it deserves, and that the moderate men, by ill-judged deliberation, would cause more calamities than all of those others. He saw the neoliberals coming, and he named the threat in 1776. I cite it because the claim that things could have been otherwise is not naivete. It is the precondition for the dialectic moving. The pale advances when people stop believing that the world can be anything other than what it currently is. The Ultra Project requires you to believe, as Joyce believes, that this is simple reality, that the mineral rights are natural, that the Coalition's administration of Revachol is the only thing standing between the city and something worse, that the third way was not a betrayal of mankind, but the best available option. That TINA. Joyce is sympathetic. She is genuinely charming. She carries real guilt alongside real pride. She is the Ultra's most honest and most human face. She is also, ultimately, the reason Martinez looks the way it does. She is the reason that the Pale is eating the world of Disco Elysium. She realizes that, while she may have survived, her daughters will grow up in an increasingly, in times, hell. The sympathy and the condemnations are both real and both necessary, because sentimental sympathy without condemnation is how you end up eating the Balfour's dinner. The feast that turns out to be dirt, the third way promise that maintains every mineral right while telling you things can only get better. Butler testified before Congress, Paine wrote for the taverns, Mill identified the ascendant class's morality as rationalized self-interest in the same book where he wrote The Most Beautiful Defense of Liberty, and then outlined the operation and constructed the charter, the intellectual infrastructure for imperial administration of the barbarians who were deemed not yet ready for the harm principle's protection, not yet human enough to deal with on human terms. These are complicated people. History does not produce simple heroes. What it produces occasionally is people honest enough to name the thing that they are looking at. Joyce is that. Finally and defiantly. With a sudden flash of teeth. No sane person identifies as an ultraliberal anymore. Not in broad daylight. Meaning, the word has been suppressed precisely because it is accurate. And precision matters. The Pale recedes when people remember, when they call things by their right names, when they stop accepting the vocabulary of the people who benefit from their confusion. The word is ultra. The framework is colonial extraction, administered at home with a blue forget-me-not and abroad with whatever artillery is available. The moment we live in is the moment the artillery is being turned inward. And the moderate men, by ill-judged deliberation, are saying, FAFO. History doesn't end. It just sleeps when enough people believe that it has. The question, the one that this essay leaves you with, is whether you are going to keep going. Whether we will sleepwalk into the mistakes of the first two world wars yet again. Whether we will accept the pens made for us, or if we will dare to dream and force the system to reach the ideal it still pretends to preach, while hiding the true ideal's corpse behind the house. We furnish the means by which we suffer. That is the condition that Joyce administers. It is also the condition that we can refuse. A couple years ago, I made a Disco Elysium video that was far more narrow and shallow in nature, and one that is now unlisted due to the sprinkling of factual errors and what turned out to be a bad call on current politics in hindsight, although the video is still available. I talked about the general political ideologies of Everard, Joyce, and the Deserter, some random fun facts, and some internal contradictions in their own personal versions of the view. But I have continued to learn and grow since then, I hope is obvious. At the time, the Leftovers podcast had just disbanded, before Ethan Klein showed his true face and gave up any pretext of morality. I have never been a Hassan fan, never watched his streams. But the way that the institutional elites on both sides are willing to smear and make him an example, an American citizen with First Amendment rights, in order to preserve the ultra system, it's impossible for me to not see where my priorities should be. Just as John Stuart Mill created the barbarian exception, just as FDR did Japanese internment, there have always been a caveat to muddle a more holistic picture of reality. American democracy has been cooed by the oligarchs and the slumbering ultra-management class. We must do the best that we can with our means to make things right for the future. Otherwise, why would we go on living at all? Many of you have no doubt noticed the videos doing poorly these last months, and the last video was even copyright claimed, so I didn't make a single cent on it. I know all too well that the economy is tough, but if you have a few dollars to give, I would really appreciate paying my bills through a contribution to my work on Patreon, Ko-fi, or even through YouTube memberships and Super Chats. I have some videos which are available only for members and only for patrons, and I have another project I want to announce that's coming up and available right now. I have started a Substack, Katalogon. While I appreciate any paid subscription, the articles will come out weekly and be available for free. They formalized the last 9 months of output somewhat into a more structured series of essays. I already have the first 20 essays completed, so there will be a consistent output for months to come. Thank you for all of those who believe in me and in this channel, and I hope to continue providing food for thought and value. Comments, likes, shares, all help, so fingers crossed that this video can escape the algorithmic quagmire. Take care of yourselves.